Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm so happy to be here with you. I am speaking from Nashville, Tennessee, in the U.S., and want to continue our review, our discussion of Wake Up and Be Happy, which is a book written by spiritual author Joanna De Angelis and psychographed by Divaldo Pereira Francos. If this is the first time you join us, well, it is the not the first book or the last book, but smack in the middle. This is the eighth book from what we call the psychological series by Joanna De Angelis, and it is a book that presents us with 30 chapters, and we go week by week discussing each chapter. And we're talking today about chapter 29. Don't you worry, we can you can look at today's video or today's live and go back to the other discussions at your will. As we know, we meet and review a single chapter of the book. So you can go to our YouTube channel, Solitude Center for Spiritual Living, if you'd like to listen to our previous discussions. I mentioned this previously, and I'd like to remind us all that the psychological series is one series book, the books that really aim at provoking reflections about ourselves. So I'm here to talk about this content, but I invite each one of us, you and me, to ponder, to pause and think about how do I feel about this topic? How does it impact who I am and how I live my life? Specifically, I would like for us to do this today. So, as we discuss our problems, or we reflect upon our problems, our conflicts, our challenges, we confront the complexities of what makes us ourselves. So, I encourage all of you to read the book and let me know if you agree or not with the interpretation. So let's go. I'm going to the next chapter because just wanted to take a brief moment to review chapter 29. Chapter 29 is all about understanding and overcoming the fear of death. Yes, death. So, how have we, and I'm speaking specifically Western society, dealt with death historically? Joanna D'Angelo gives a glimpse in this chapter of how we have handled the concept of death and how early Christians specifically, she writes quite a lot about how those who lived in the early Christian days, and I'm talking about the first 300 years, 400 years after Jesus came to earth, right? So those individuals that lived in that time period and believed in Jesus, how did they deal with death? And then she gives another glimpse of a transformation of what we call the Middle Ages, those 1,000 years between the those early Christian days to Renaissance, right? So about from the fourth, fifth century to depending on who coins Renaissance to the 1300, 1400, where Renaissance proper became a reality. So the concept of death has changed. And we here in the next 20 plus minutes, we're going to discuss the context of immortality of the soul and how it is so important for you, for me, to understand the idea of the survival of the spirit and how that concept provides us with a sense of peace and calm and serenity when we confront death of ourselves and our loved ones. So I'll go over the chapter in the next few minutes, and I will uh, subdivide that context that you find in the chapter by discussing about illusion, about the survival of the spirit, and of course, liberation. Shall we? So let's discuss now the idea of illusion. So, Joanna brings this interesting discussion about illusion. You know, the material life that we live is an illusion. And she states that basically falling prey to this illusion is what leads us to pain and suffering. Hmm. I stop here to say, is that right? Are all sources of my own pain and my own suffering directly connected with the idea that life is an illusion? And if so, what are the illusions that she's referring to? Right? And what comes to my mind are, oh, the idea of success, the idea of beauty, the idea of wealth, or not even the idea, the illusion, right? Of power, of fashion, of youth, so on and so forth. So the illusion that our society, right? I'm speaking from the US, therefore I'm speaking from the viewpoint, the perspective of a society that is immersed, and that society, the context of society, helps us foster those ideas, because the paradigm, the construct of our society is one of based on individualism, capitalism, and consumerism. So falling prey to the trappings of our society just means that, yes, we spend our lifetimes to look, to attain, to hold on to those illusions of success, whatever they may be. You and I may vary a little bit, but it's mostly based on those inputs, illusory inputs to the idea of success. So beauty, wealth, power, fashion, so on and so forth. And it's hard for many of us. We were discussing the other day about the King of England, Elizabeth II, upon her passing, and the concept that was she was she trapped by those illusions, right, of power and wealth that she has and her family members have, and most importantly, how easy it is perhaps for someone that is born in that lineage to have access to that versus somebody perhaps that was born in very different circumstances. So lots of interesting discussions here, but we have to think about as we attain those, however easy or not, right? That it's not so easily spread across our almost 8 billion people in on Earth today. And once we attain, because we believe more in scarcity than abundance, we are afraid of losing. And boy, that generates at an individual level conflicts at a macro level in terms of our society. It generates wars and conflicts that are quite difficult for us to accept. But um, if and this is Joanna's proposal, right? If we believe that this life, the life that we live in a material existence, is a life where we are loaned all physical resources, we we should really not be so attached to those physical resources. We don't own them, we're loaned. And as a consequence, we should not worry if we lose them. Better said than done, right? And I pause here to ask you and me, what are the physical resources that she's referring to? Why are these physical resources an illusion? And yes, I ask why they are an illusion when they feel so real to us. How can we look through them, pass through them, to really understand that it is nothing but a figment of our imagination, right? So I have to tell you that when we're discussing this, what my mind went straight to was the allegory of the cave that was brought to us 600 years, give or take, to before Christ, right? So in the sixth century BC, um, Plato. So we hear a lot about uh, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Plato was a disciple, right, and of Socrates, and he brought that idea that which is really an allegory of the effect of education. That was his premise. If you have education, if you understand a concept versus not having that, and how does that change how you see society, how we go through that illusion. So, what is the story? Well, Plato describes a group of people that have been chained. They were not born there, but they were captured in prison and pretty much lived their entire lives chained to the wall of a cave. And they were chained, so they only looked at one wall of the cave, and there was a those that imprisoned them put a fire so they wouldn't die of cold, right? So there's a fire behind them, and yes, people that passed by them in the back projected their shadow onto the cave, and they also heard noises, and the noises became distorted, and what they saw in terms of what they're carrying became their reality. So basically, in a very, very quick snapshot, the idea is that the fragments of reality that the prisoners perceived, and they perceived through only their senses, their sight, right? Um, they it was distorted. It was not reality, but they believed it was. So, long story short, one the prisoners leave the cave, and yes, it blinded him because he was not used to it momentarily. But then he comes out and he starts to see, wow, look at the world. There's so much more. And he comes back to the cave and he tries to free those slaves, those people who are in prison there. And they say, no, I don't want to go because this is my reality. So, a very, very cursory view of the, the, the cave, Plato's cave. I'd love for you to read if you have not read about it. It's quite interesting. But we come to term with the notion that understanding our reality, and I put reality in capital letters in my mind, right? The reality that our only true expression of life and our human existence is the notion that life is not what we see in the cave. Oh, back. That life continues after the death of our material body. So we can start by first and foremost dissipating the illusion that whatever it is, that illusion that we hold on, and prepare for the inevitability of our death, our corporeal death, right? That will be an experience that we go through. And to be able to do that, we should also change how we live life, right? Because we need to understand. So if there is life after life, or life after death in this case, I need to live a life that prepares me for life after this life. I need to understand that all of those physical resources that Joanna is speaking here are indeed just loaned to us. We need to detach our sense of ownership that they belong to us, and that we also have to realize, we have to understand, we have to acknowledge that love, love through charity, love through compassion, love to fraternity is the only thing that matters, right? When we break the chains that is imprisoning us in the cave to the illusion of success based on a material life, we will be free. Wow. Lots of good stuff. But let's talk a little bit about, we talked about illusion. Let's now reframe our discussion to the idea of the survival of the spirit. And and she mentions, as you can read this in the slide, survival of the spirit is the crowning moment of physical existence, which is transformed by the biological phenomenon of death. So we now start to think about it. Yes, it's important for us to understand that there is life after death, that death is inevitable, and that to be free, we need to have courage to get out of our caves, right? And she describes in this chapter, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of it, but she describes the early Christians. And as I mentioned before, they were those in that time period, right? About fourth, fifth century, depending on where you read. And those individuals, they believed in Jesus before Christianity was declared the Roman official religion, right? So because they believed and they lived their lives in based on the the teachings of Jesus, and they did not accept the other external mandates of how they lived their lives, they were often persecuted, as we know, tortured, and often killed by and for their beliefs, right? And historical accounts of the death of those early Christians is quite interesting to us, because they those accounts tell us that those individuals were faced with death with joy. They often sang in the middle of, and you can imagine it, if you go to a museum, or if you visit places like, I don't know, Rome in Italy, etc., you were faced with all the depiction of those that became saints by the church, of a thousand arrows. I'm thinking of Saint Jerome, or others that were burned alive, right? There's so many depictions of agonizing types of killing of the flesh, and they faced it with joy. They faced, while singing, doing that terrible process. And they were told, they believed that the limitations of their physical body were just a temporary um, time, and indeed a temporary prison. while it was accepted by the early Christian that the material body restricts our spirit, they focus then, okay, I'm being persecuted, I may be tortured, I may die, and I believe, I really believe, I have the faith in what that Jesus taught us, which is basically the fact that this will go, this is temporary, and that for me to be prepared, and the key word here is preparation. The key for me to be prepared to continue in the right journey, right? I need to spend time looking at my sentiments. And I need to look for courage and strength in the hope, right? By the hope that I have a future life based in the concept of eternal love. So early Christians were confident. They really knew that their spiritual um, uh, uh, their spiritual life was really a reflection of their immortal dimension. They did not fear death. They did not fear the death of their loved ones. So they lived in harmony despite all that was going on around them. They lived in harmony, they lived in peace, they lived a material existence with the awareness that why we're here, what for, right? What was the purpose of living here was simply to learn. Therefore, this is a school of sorts. So when or if persecuted or martyred, they also saw the activities during imprisonment and martyrdom as, oops, I'm going to go back home faster than I expected. That's kind of cute for me to think of that. But they saw that martyrdom and suffering as some sort of sublimation of their past errors, and that the sense of faster ascension. So call me crazy, but the picture that comes to my mind is, because we talk about ascension, we talk about a kind of pain through the ascension, and faster than we thought, was the image that came to my mind was the movie Hollywood. At its best, Top Gun, the remake, not the remake, the 20 years later, however many years it was, 35 years later, where the students prepared for their mission go through those G10 forces, right? And often it was just very hard on their bodies, but they prepared and they had a very powerful training to be successful in their mission. So very, very interesting if you think about the parallels of that. But back to Joanna, back to the early questions. They knew that choosing their faith, they were also risking submitting to pain, right? They also knew that as they lived the faith of being an early Christian, that they may be separated from their families. They may indeed lose all of their belongings, but never despaired, because they knew once that that all of it, all the material items, were just an illusion. And upon death, they would reunite with those they loved. So it's very interesting how the and the early Christians, most of them died quite young, right? But knowing that their choice of how they would live their lives would put them, quote unquote, at peril, right? They lived a life very different than those that feel differently. Therefore, their lives was one of, okay, let me prepare for the next life. Let me focus on what's needed. And And it's important for us to understand that Christianity, as well as Spiritism, both are focused, they're based on that idea of immortality and the survival of the spirit, right? So it's important for us to think about that because as Joanna goes and flips the story to talk, to narrate, to discuss very briefly, by the way, the difference between early Christian lives and the lives of those in the Middle Ages, she started to see a much darker relationship to death, right? And she describes very vividly, in my opinion, how all of a sudden there were so many rituals, quite dark, quite depressing, and even macabre related to death. Very different. And she brings the notion that this is the time, this is the era of professional mourners. There is the time that the superstitions and actually fanaticism abounded, and all of those ideas conspire, they get together, and they lead to a sense of horror and discouragement. Death, as it becomes a business, right, gives a very different view of our transition, right? The focus shifts from let's give homage to the life that is coming, that the spiritual life, into no, we got to provide homage to the life that was lived on earth and all that we need to do to the body that was left behind and the sense of loss for not being able to continue a material life. And it's important because when we do this, we also start to dissipate or start to dilute the idea of our own immortality if we keep focusing on that body in the cemetery. And I say that as we come very close, right, to in Mexico, for example, the Day of the Dead, which is a very interesting interpretation. But there are in right here at the end of October, we deal with facing our own feelings about death, dying, and our ancestors, our loved ones who passed before us. And I pause even to think about it, but we are ending our days, and I say this because the pandemic has been somehow normalized, right? And we start to overcome the fear of the ravages of COVID-19. And we live still, the pandemic is still very real, but we start to deal with, wow, end of the third year more or less of dealing with a global pandemic. How do I feel about all of my loved ones who passed because of it, as it was part of this? How do I feel about all of those that had to go to the hospital and suffer so much? Right. So I say that because we need to deal with our faith in the indestructibility of life, right? And the notion that death is but a stop in the continuum of our journey toward becoming pure spirits. So I ask of you, what are we doing to ensure our journey is light and it is easy? So, just to finalize, we talked a little bit about liberation, freedom, right? And the view of the butterfly to me is just most beautiful, right? And I'd say that the message from Joanna in this chapter is a message of indeed encouragement and an invitation for us to live a life that is full, And it's a life that is also focused on preparing for our moment of liberation, preparing emotionally for the return home. The journey back home, this transition, or I could call the transportation, if you think of a train, right? Should be easy, should be light, it should be enjoyable, it should be an adventure where we come back home full of stories. And this is the things that come to my mind, but coming back home full of stories and lessons that we learned during our time away, right? So death, which is the end of a material body, a material cycle, should only be feared by those of us who became slaves of an illusion and unable to move from one cycle to the next, right? And there are so many examples that we could think of, but just because of time, let's think about, you know, oh yes, I'm going to a resort and it's a 5 star somewhere in the world. It's beautiful, idyllic. I'm pampered. I have access to everything. It's all inclusive. I can do and I can the pleasures of the flesh, the pleasures of just doing nothing but going perhaps to the pool, to the beach, and we believe that this is life. No, it's not. It was an interesting goal, and we fought for it and we did that. But let's not be imprisoned by that. Oh, I don't know, 5 day vacation as this is the reality and I'm going to suffer when I go back, right? So when we overcome the anguish of losing, and I have to say the loss of identity is quite difficult, right? The loss of the people we love, and the loss of a well-known reality, or what we think is a reality, thinking again of the cave, right? Let's overcome that fear. Let's fill our hearts. Let's fill ourselves with joy in the certainty that we, oh, very much like a farmer that gets a seed, right, and watches the seed die and the next cycle to begin, where the seed becomes a little, a little plant that it grows, that has flowers and bears fruit, and we are ready forever to see the benefits of the harvest of that transformation, that death, if you will. So, my friends, survival of the spirit is indeed the bright light at the end of a tunnel. So thank you so much for being here. We meet again next week and we will discuss, yes, our last chapter, chapter 30th, Christmas of Love. Thank you and see you next Sunday.